guys, Amedio602 here, and today I'm going to tell you a story about my new friend. Let's call him John. You see, John just got into PC gaming and he's been playing a lot of Warzone, but he's also having trouble with his FPS. After watching my latest video on FPS and Warzone, John decided to hit me up on Twitter, and if you're interested in doing what John did, there's a link to my Twitter down in the description below. John told me he was running a 3070 and he was only able to get 100 FPS with that card. And since I have a 3070 myself, I knew for sure that the card was capable of a lot more than that. So I asked John what kind of CPU and what kind of RAM he's running, and he replied that he was running a Ryzen 5 3600 with 16 GB of RAM. The problem that John has is that his CPU is not able to keep up with his GPU. When you're gaming or doing anything else on a computer, you have to look out for what's called the bottleneck of the system. And if you're not familiar what a bottleneck is, here's a real-world example to describe it to you. Let's pretend you work for a delivery company. The fastest that delivery truck can go is 50 miles an hour. Now let's pretend that the delivery company that you work for also monitors the speed in their vehicles, and they have a zero-tolerance policy against speeding. When you're on a street, you can't go over the posted speed limit. That means that the fastest you can go is either the posted speed limit or the speed of the truck, which was 50 miles an hour. So if you're on a 60 mile per hour speed limit road, your truck still only goes 50 miles an hour. If you're on a 35 mile an hour speed limit road, then you can only go 35 miles an hour. PCs, and gaming in particular, is very similar to this example. In John's case, his CPU had a speed limit of 100 frames per second, but his GPU could go much faster than that. And Warzone's really cool because it has a built-in overlay that will give you a good approximation of just how much faster your other components could go. These overlays are called GPU time and CPU time. And if you want to know the potential for your GPU or your CPU, you can turn these on in the options menu. Unfortunately, the overlay does not tell you exactly what the FPS is going to be, so we're going to have to do a little bit of math to figure that out. If you're allergic to math, have no fear, I'm going to put some charts up on the screen to help you out. The first thing you need to know is that these overlays show you the render time in milliseconds. But most people aren't really interested in render time, they want to know how many frames per second they can get. Well, we've got 1000 milliseconds per second, so in order to convert from millisecond frame times into frames per second, we need to take 1000 divided by the render time shown on the screen, and that gives us an approximate frame rate. The frame time shown on the screen is rounded to the nearest millisecond, that's why we're going to have a range in the chart. In John's example, he was getting 10 milliseconds for CPU time and 8 milliseconds for GPU time. If you take 1000 divided by 10, that gives you right around the 100 frames per second that he was reporting. For the GPU, you would take 1000 divided by the GPU time, which is 8 milliseconds, which gives you approximately 125 frames per second. That means that John's bottleneck is his CPU and not his GPU. In other words, this means that John could upgrade his GPU and still not see any increases in his frames per second. Going back to the truck analogy, this means that if John wants to go faster than 35 miles an hour, he doesn't need to upgrade his truck. His truck can already go up to 50. What he needs to do is turn and drive down a different road with a higher speed limit. So when you're upgrading, keep this in mind. And that brings us to another important topic, which is which component do you want to be the bottleneck of your system? My preference for this is the GPU. I prefer to have the GPU be the limiting factor on the system because that leaves some headroom in the CPU to perform other tasks. For instance, if there's an update running in the background and the CPU has enough spare cycles to handle that download, then it's not going to cause your frame rate to stutter. On the other hand, if your limiting factor is the CPU, then anything that makes that CPU slow down is going to affect your frame rate. This could be a virus scanner running, a download running in the background, Windows updates, anything like that can cause this. The GPU only really has one task while you're playing Warzone, and that's to crank out frames as quickly as possible. The CPU is much more general purpose and is going to be performing dozens of other tasks. This is one of the reasons that a lot of people have very inconsistent frame rates all over the Warzone is that they are CPU limited. You can tell if you're CPU or GPU limited by checking the CPU time and GPU time overlays like we talked about before. If that doesn't work for you, or if those numbers are reporting the same thing, then just check your GPU utilization. If it's in the mid to upper 90s, then you're probably GPU limited. When I changed this to be CPU bound, you could see that the frame rates are just all over the place, there's a huge variance in them, and in this particular scene I'm just standing still, not even moving. With a better understanding of bottlenecks and GPU versus CPU frame times, John can now go forth and make an educated decision. I've got links to some of the gear I recommend for playing Warzone in the description down below. Those are Amazon affiliate links, so you are helping out the channel just by clicking on them. And if you want to boost your frame rate even more in the Warzone, Check out the video on the screen right now and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss out on my future uploads. And as always, thank you very much for watching.